Sponsor table, my daughter-in-law said with a laugh loud enough for half the ballroom to hear. It just felt more accurate than family. A few people chuckled awkwardly. Someone dropped their champagne flute against a linen-covered table nearby, and I stood there in the middle of the Whitmore Grand Ballroom, holding a cream-colored place card that suddenly felt heavier than the diamond bracelet on my wrist. Sponsor table. Not mother of the groom. Not family. Sponsor. I smiled anyway. At 68 years old, I had learned that dignity often looks like silence to people who mistake kindness for weakness. It's just a joke, Margaret, Vanessa added quickly, brushing invisible lint from the sleeve of her designer gown. Her smile was polished and camera-ready. The kind young women practiced in mirrors long before weddings and social media made performance a full-time occupation. You know how people are these days. I looked at her carefully then. Her perfect blonde hair swept into an elegant low bun, her diamond earrings catching the chandelier light. Her hand resting possessively on Daniel's arm, like she had already claimed every corner of his life. My son didn't say a word. That hurt more than the joke itself. Daniel had Richard's eyes. My late husband used to say our son had inherited my soft heart too, though lately I wondered where that part had gone. He shifted uncomfortably beside her, loosening the collar of his tuxedo like the room had suddenly grown too warm. But he never corrected her, never took the card from my hand, never said, "That's my mother." Instead, he gave me the same tight smile he'd been giving me for months. The smile people use when they want gratitude without responsibility. Mom paid for half this wedding, Vanessa announced to a nearby group of bridesmaids carrying crystal champagne coupes. We figured we should honor our biggest investor. More laughter. Thin laughter. Nervous laughter. The kind people use when they know something is cruel but don't want to become the next target. I folded the place card once. Then again. My fingers stayed steady even though something inside my chest had begun to crack quietly beneath the music of the string quartet. 300 guests filled the ballroom that evening. White roses climbed gold archways near the dance floor. Floating candles reflected against towering windows overlooking Lake Michigan. The wedding planner had imported Italian silk linens because Vanessa said regular satin looked cheap on camera. I would know. I paid for those too, along with the custom floral arrangements. The 5-tier cake. The honeymoon suite in Napa Valley. The live jazz band scheduled for later that evening. Vanessa had called me sweet names every time another invoice arrived. Margaret, you have such elegant taste. Margaret, I don't know what we'd do without you. Margaret, you're more generous than my own mother. Funny how generosity becomes invisible the moment the check clears. I slipped the folded place card into my clutch purse and glanced across the ballroom toward the sweetheart table glowing beneath soft candlelight. Vanessa's parents sat beside it, laughing comfortably with relatives and close friends. Their table displayed a gold sign reading Bride's Family. Mine sat near the back beside two elderly cousins from Milwaukee I barely recognized anymore. Sponsor table. I suddenly understood something standing there beneath those glittering chandeliers. I hadn't been invited to this wedding as Daniel's mother. I had been invited as financing. The waiter offered me a glass of champagne as I made my way toward the back corner of the ballroom, but I declined with a polite shake of my head. I needed my thoughts clear tonight. The music swelled softly beneath the chandeliers while guests drifted across the polished marble floor in clusters of laughter and expensive perfume. Everywhere I looked, people admired the wedding as if it had appeared by magic. No one saw the years behind it. No one saw the retirement account I quietly dipped into 6 months earlier after Daniel called me sounding exhausted and ashamed. "We are just a little short on the venue deposit, Mom," he had said back then. I would never ask if it was not important. Richard had been gone for almost 4 years by then, and hearing my son sound vulnerable awakened every protective instinct I still carried as a mother. I wired $25,000 the next morning. After that came the flowers. Vanessa said white roses were timeless, but imported roses in November cost more than my first car back in 1978. Then came the catering upgrade because Vanessa wanted a luxury guest experience. Then the custom dance floor. Then the Napa Valley honeymoon suite with private vineyard tours and chauffeured transportation. Every request arrived wrapped in sweetness. Vanessa always knew how to soften her voice when money was involved. "You have such refined taste, Margaret. You always understand elegance. Daniel is lucky to have a mother like you." Sometimes she even kissed my cheek after brunch meetings with wedding planners and vendors. Looking back now, I realized affection had become part of the transaction. I reached my assigned table and sat beside an elderly couple from Milwaukee who spent most of the evening discussing traffic outside Chicago. Across the ballroom, Vanessa moved from table to table, glowing beneath soft candlelight, accepting compliments like a queen greeting loyal subjects. Daniel followed half a step behind her, carrying the exhausted smile of a man trying to survive his own wedding. Every now and then he glanced toward me, but never long enough to hold eye contact. That hurt more than Vanessa ever could. A mother notices when her child starts treating her like an obligation instead of a person. I noticed it first after Richard's funeral. Daniel became distracted, busy, always rushing somewhere. Vanessa slowly filled the silence Richard left behind. At first, I blamed grief, then work, then adulthood. Mothers are very skilled at explaining away heartbreak when it comes from their children. Margaret, I looked up to see the wedding planner approaching with a clipboard pressed against her black satin dress. Her smile looked strained. There is a small issue with one of the vendor authorizations. Vanessa said you already approved the additional champagne tower and late-night dessert bar. I blinked slowly. Additional what? Her expression faltered for half a second before professionalism returned. Oh, I am sorry. I assumed you knew. She lowered her voice carefully. The final upgrades totaled another $18,000 this week. $18,000. I stared at her without speaking while the string quartet continued playing somewhere behind us. Then I looked toward the glowing sweetheart table again. Vanessa laughed at something one of her bridesmaids whispered into her ear. Daniel laughed too, though he looked tired doing it. And suddenly I understood something even colder than humiliation. They had stopped seeing my generosity as a gift a long time ago. To them, it had become access. Unlimited access. For a long moment, I simply sat there with my hands folded neatly in my lap while the wedding planner apologized beside me in a nervous whisper. Around us, crystal glasses clinked softly beneath the glow of chandeliers, and somewhere near the dance floor, guests applauded as Vanessa and Daniel greeted another wave of relatives. It amazed me how humiliation could exist so quietly inside beautiful places. I am sure it was just a misunderstanding, the planner said gently. Vanessa mentioned you preferred not to be bothered with small details. Small details. $18,000 had somehow become a small detail. I gave her a calm smile. Thank you for letting me know. Her shoulders visibly relaxed before she hurried away toward the catering staff, relieved to escape the conversation. I watched her disappear into the crowd and suddenly remembered something Richard told me years ago during one of his charity galas in Boston. We had been married almost 30 years back then. Watch how people behave around money, Maggie, he said quietly while adjusting his cufflinks in our hotel suite. Money does not change character. It reveals comfort. At the time, I thought he sounded cynical. Richard had spent decades building Whitmore Financial Group from a small consulting office into a respected regional firm. He understood ambition better than I ever would. But I always believed family existed outside of transactions. Tonight, sitting alone at a table labeled sponsor, I realized Richard had understood something I did not. Some people only act loving when they are comfortable, benefiting from you. A burst of laughter near the bar pulled my attention back across the ballroom. Vanessa stood surrounded by bridesmaids and distant cousins, one manicured hand wrapped around a champagne flute while the other rested dramatically against her chest. Honestly, if I had let Daniel's mother make all the decisions, this wedding would have looked like a country club luncheon from 1992. The women around her laughed immediately, not because it was funny, because Vanessa expected them to. One of the bridesmaids noticed me watching and quickly looked away. Vanessa followed her gaze. For half a second, our eyes met across the ballroom. She smiled brightly, too brightly. The kind of smile people use when they realize they may have said too much. Then she turned her back toward me completely. I looked down at my untouched dinner plate. Filet mignon, roasted asparagus, truffle mashed potatoes. The catering package Vanessa insisted guests would remember forever. I suddenly lost my appetite. Margaret, a familiar voice interrupted my thoughts. I looked up to see Helen Carter standing beside the table, holding a silver clutch purse against her navy silk dress. Helen and Richard had served together on the board of a children's hospital charity for nearly 15 years. She was one of the few people at this wedding who still looked at me like a person instead of a resource. I have been trying to find you all evening, she said softly before sitting beside me without waiting for permission. Her expression shifted slightly as she glanced at the gold table sign beside us. Sponsor table. I noticed the exact moment she understood. Oh, Margaret, she whispered quietly. I forced another composed smile. It is creative, I suppose. Helen did not smile back. Instead, she leaned closer and lowered her voice. I overheard Vanessa in the bridal suite earlier. Something in her tone made my stomach tighten instantly. What did she say? Helen hesitated only briefly. She told the bridesmaids that once the wedding was over, she and Daniel planned to start setting firmer boundaries with you. Boundaries. Modern families always seem to use soft words for cruel intentions. Helen continued carefully. Margaret, she said you have become too financially attached to their lives. She said Daniel feels guilty every time you help them, so it is better if they create some distance after the honeymoon. I stared at the candle flickering at the center of the table while her words settled quietly inside me. Not grief, not anger, something colder. Because suddenly every sweet phone call from Vanessa made sense. Every invitation, every compliment, every thank you card written in perfect cursive. They had never been building closeness. They had been managing access. Helen sat quietly beside me while servers moved through the ballroom, carrying silver trays of miniature crab cakes and champagne refills. Around us, the reception continued glowing with effortless elegance. Soft jazz floated through the air now instead of the string quartet. Guests laughed beneath crystal chandeliers while cameras flashed near the dance floor. From a distance, it looked like a perfect American wedding. Wealthy family, beautiful bride, successful son. But once you have lived long enough, you learn that appearances are often the most expensive part of any relationship. I almost did not tell you, Helen admitted softly, smoothing one hand over the silk napkin in her lap. But Richard was my friend for 30 years. He would never forgive me for staying quiet. Richard, just hearing his name grounded me for a moment. My husband always noticed things before I did, especially when it came to people using charm as camouflage. I remembered one evening nearly 2 years ago after Daniel first introduced Vanessa at our lake house in Wisconsin. Richard had been standing at the kitchen counter pouring bourbon while Vanessa toured the property with Daniel outside. She is very polished, I said back then, trying to sound supportive. Richard glanced through the window toward the dock, where Vanessa stood laughing dramatically with one hand resting on Daniel's chest. Too polished, he replied quietly. I laughed at him at the time. You distrust everyone under 40. No, he said calmly before taking a sip of bourbon. I distrust people who study rooms before they enter them. At the time, I thought he was being unfair. Vanessa was beautiful, ambitious, socially graceful. The kind of young woman magazines described as sophisticated. She remembered birthdays, sent handwritten thank you cards, always complimented my jewelry and asked thoughtful questions about Richard's business stories. But now, sitting in the ballroom she had partially funded with my retirement savings, I realized Richard had seen something I missed. Vanessa never entered a room emotionally. She entered strategically. My eyes drifted toward the sweetheart table again. Vanessa leaned toward Daniel, whispering something into his ear while photographers circled them like orbiting planets. He smiled automatically. Tired. Obedient. Smaller somehow. I suddenly wondered how long Daniel had been slowly surrendering pieces of himself just to keep peace inside that relationship. Margaret, Helen said carefully, pulling me back into the moment. There is something else. I looked at her. She hesitated. Earlier tonight in the bridal suite, one of the bridesmaids joked that Vanessa should thank you during her speech. Vanessa laughed and said, please. If Margaret stopped paying for things, Daniel would finally learn how expensive life actually is. I felt my chest tighten slightly, though my face remained calm. She said that. Helen nodded slowly, and Daniel was standing there. I already knew the answer before asking. Did he defend me? Helen looked away for a second. Silence answered clearly enough. I glanced down at my wedding ring still resting on my left hand after 4 years of widowhood. Richard used to tease me for never taking it off. You know we are already legally married, Maggie. He would joke every anniversary. But tonight, touching the cool gold band with my thumb, I realized something painful. Richard had protected me from more than loneliness all those years. He protected me from becoming emotionally negotiable inside my own family. A sudden burst of applause erupted near the dance floor as Daniel and Vanessa prepared for their first dance. Guests gathered closer with glowing smiles and raised phones. Vanessa looked radiant beneath the warm ballroom lights, while Daniel rested one hand carefully against her waist. Everyone admired them. Everyone believed they were witnessing love. But sitting there beneath the gold sign that reduced me to a financial role, I finally understood the difference between being valued and being useful. And for the first time all evening, I stopped feeling embarrassed. Instead, I started paying attention. The dance floor glowed beneath soft amber lights while Daniel and Vanessa swayed slowly to an acoustic version of Can You Feel the Love Tonight? Guests gathered in a half circle around them, holding champagne glasses and phones raised carefully into the air. Vanessa rested her head against Daniel's shoulder with practiced elegance, smiling every few seconds for nearby cameras. Watching them from across the ballroom felt strangely surreal, like watching strangers reenact scenes from a life I used to belong to. I remember Daniel's 8th birthday party in our backyard outside Milwaukee. He wore a little navy sweater Richard bought him from a department store downtown and spent the entire afternoon running through sprinklers with chocolate cake smeared across his cheeks. At one point, he climbed into my lap soaking wet and wrapped his tiny arms around my neck. "You are my favorite person," he whispered sleepily before falling asleep against my shoulder later that evening. Mothers remember things like that forever. We remember the weight of our children before the world teaches them distance. I looked at him now standing beneath crystal chandeliers beside a woman who spoke about me like an overextended credit line, and for the first time in my life, I allowed myself to ask a question I had spent years avoiding. When exactly had my son stopped protecting my dignity? "You are very quiet," Helen observed gently beside me. I smoothed invisible wrinkles from my black evening gown. "I think I finally understand the arrangement." Helen frowned slightly. "Arrangement?" I watched Vanessa laugh again while guests applauded the ending of the dance. "Affection in exchange for convenience. Inclusion in exchange for money. Gratitude while the account remains open." The words sounded colder aloud than they had inside my head, but they also sounded true. That was the unsettling thing about truth at my age. Once you finally see it clearly, it becomes impossible to unsee. The music shifted into something livelier as guests returned to their tables, and waiters rolled out elaborate dessert displays lined with gold-trimmed pastries and imported chocolates. Another upgrade I had apparently funded without knowing. Near the bar, I noticed Vanessa speaking privately with the wedding planner again. Both women glanced briefly in my direction before lowering their voices. Vanessa's smile disappeared the moment she thought nobody important was looking at her. That interested me more than it should have. "Excuse me for a moment," I told Helen quietly before standing from my chair. The ballroom suddenly felt warmer as I crossed the marble floor past laughing relatives and glowing floral arrangements. Nobody stopped me. Nobody noticed me much at all. That was the strange freedom of becoming emotionally invisible in your own family. People stop guarding themselves around you. As I approached the hallway leading toward the bridal suite and vendor offices, I heard Vanessa's voice before I saw her. "I told you to run the extra charges through the original authorization," she snapped quietly. "She never checks the details anyway." I slowed my steps instinctively. The planner sounded nervous. "Vanessa, legally I really need signed approval for the vendor additions." Vanessa let out a sharp breath. "Please." Margaret would rather overpay than embarrass herself asking questions in public. Silence followed for a moment. Then Vanessa laughed softly. "Honestly, she still thinks helping us means we will stay emotionally close after this." My fingers tightened slightly around my clutch purse. Not from anger. Something steadier than that. Clarity. Because suddenly every moment from the past 2 years aligned perfectly inside my mind. The expensive birthday gifts sent after ignored phone calls. The carefully timed invitations before financial requests. The exaggerated praise whenever Daniel needed help with mortgage payments or travel expenses. Vanessa had not been building family bonds. She had been maintaining investor confidence. I stepped back quietly before either woman noticed me standing there. Then I walked calmly toward the ballroom again beneath the soft glow of hallway sconces, my heels clicking gently against polished marble. The strange thing was, I no longer felt wounded. Wounds imply surprise, and surprise disappears the moment illusion finally dies. When I returned to the ballroom, the energy felt different somehow. Not because anything around me had changed, but because I had. The music still floated softly through the air. Guests still admired the floral arrangements and crystal candle holders glowing against white linen tables. Vanessa still smiled for photographs like a woman auditioning for a luxury bridal magazine. But now I could see the machinery underneath it all. Every compliment, every performance, every carefully managed interaction. Once illusion cracks, even beautiful things begin to look staged. I resumed my seat quietly just as servers began placing dessert plates in front of guests. Gold leaf chocolate mousse, miniature cheesecakes topped with sugared raspberries, imported espresso flown in from Italy because Vanessa insisted regular coffee would ruin the atmosphere. Across the ballroom, Daniel stood near the bar speaking with two business associates from Whitmore Financial Group. He laughed politely at something one of them said, but there was tension in his shoulders tonight that had not been there a year ago. Exhaustion, too. I wondered if he even recognized himself anymore. "You look calmer," Helen observed softly beside me. I folded my napkin carefully across my lap. "I am." She studied me for a moment. "That surprises me." I glanced toward the sweetheart table where Vanessa adjusted the train of her gown for another round of photographs. Pain becomes much easier to carry once confusion disappears. Helen said nothing after that. She did not need to. Women our age understand silence better than most people understand conversation. A few minutes later, my phone vibrated gently inside my clutch purse. I excused myself from the table and stepped toward a quieter hallway near the ballroom entrance before answering. Margaret Whitmore speaking. "Mrs. Whitmore, this is Alan Brooks from Brooks and Hayes Private Accounting." Alan handled several of the Whitmore family trusts and financial authorizations after Richard passed away. His voice sounded unusually careful tonight. "I apologize for contacting you during the reception, but there is an issue regarding several transfers connected to the wedding accounts." I leaned lightly against the marble wall. "What kind of issue?" Papers shuffled softly on the other end. "Over the past 3 weeks, multiple expedited payments were requested through verbal authorization under your household account. Most were approved through wedding vendors connected to Vanessa Whitmore." My expression remained perfectly still. "How much?" A brief pause followed. "Including tonight's additional vendor modifications, approximately $78,000 beyond the original approved budget." $78,000. The number should have shocked me. Instead, it settled into place with strange precision, like the final piece of a puzzle I had already completed emotionally. Alan lowered his voice further. "There is another concern. 2 pending wire transfers totaling nearly $40,000 are scheduled to process after midnight tonight." I closed my eyes briefly. "Who authorized them?" Another pause. "The requests were submitted under Daniel Whitmore's secondary access credentials." "Daniel." For a moment, all I could hear was the distant sound of laughter drifting from the ballroom. My son's name lingered quietly between grief and disappointment inside my chest. Not because of the money itself. Richard and I had built more wealth than I would ever spend in one lifetime. It was the permission that wounded me. The assumption that my generosity no longer required honesty. "Mrs. Whitmore?" Alan asked carefully. I opened my eyes again and stared through the ballroom doors where Vanessa stood raising a champagne glass for another photograph. "Beautiful. Celebrated. Untouchable. Cancel the pending transfers," I said calmly. "Immediately." Alan hesitated. "Would you like me to notify Daniel first?" "No," my voice remained soft. Steady. "I would prefer tonight's surprises to remain evenly distributed." After ending the call, I stood alone in the hallway for another moment beneath the warm glow of crystal sconces. Then I smoothed one hand over my evening gown, adjusted the diamond bracelet Richard gave me on our 40th anniversary, and walked back into the reception smiling politely. Nobody noticed the difference. But for the first time all evening, I was no longer the woman funding the performance. I was the woman quietly controlling how it ended. By 10:30 that evening, the ballroom had settled into the comfortable illusion of a successful reception. Guests loosened ties and kicked off expensive heels beneath the tables, while waiters circulated with trays of bourbon and espresso martinis. Laughter came easier now that dinner and formalities were over. The younger guests crowded the dance floor beneath pulsing amber lights, while older relatives gathered near the bar discussing lake houses, retirement plans, and grandchildren. From the outside, everything still looked perfect. Vanessa especially understood the value of appearances. She moved through the ballroom like someone born for admiration, stopping gracefully for photographs and compliments while carefully touching Daniel's arm often enough to maintain the image of effortless affection. But once you know someone is performing, the performance becomes exhausting to watch. I remained seated near the edge of the ballroom with Helen while slowly stirring melting ice in a glass of sparkling water. Every few minutes, Vanessa glanced in my direction with brief irritation flickering behind her smile. I suspected she had already learned the pending transfers were frozen. The realization pleased me more than it should have. "You look younger suddenly," Helen murmured quietly beside me. I smiled faintly. "No, just less confused." Before she could respond, the master of ceremonies stepped onto the small stage near the dance floor and tapped gently against the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, if we could have your attention for a few special toasts tonight." Guests slowly returned toward their seats carrying drinks and dessert plates while soft applause spread through the ballroom. Vanessa immediately straightened in her chair beside Daniel, smoothing one hand across the front of her gown before accepting the microphone with polished confidence. She looked radiant standing beneath the chandelier light. Controlled, beautiful, untouchable. "First," she began warmly, "thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate the happiest day of our lives." Applause followed automatically. Vanessa smiled graciously before continuing. "Planning this wedding has definitely been a journey." A few guests laughed softly. "There were moments I honestly thought we would never survive all the opinions, budgeting meetings, and emotional investments." More polite laughter. Then Vanessa glanced directly toward me with a smile too sharp to be accidental. "But thankfully, Daniel's mother believes no amount of money is too much when appearances are involved." Several guests shifted awkwardly in their seats. Vanessa continued anyway. "In fact, if anyone here needs financial advice tonight, Margaret will probably hand you an invoice before dessert." A few nervous laughs escaped from nearby tables, but the energy in the ballroom changed instantly. Not dramatic, just subtle enough for everyone to feel it. I noticed Daniel tense beside her. His smile disappeared for half a second before returning weaker than before. Vanessa laughed lightly into the microphone as though she had simply delivered a harmless joke among family. Then she added the sentence that finally removed any remaining doubt inside me. "Honestly, she may be the only person capable of turning generosity into a business transaction." Silence followed that one. Thin, uncomfortable. Even the waitstaff seemed to pause briefly near the ballroom doors. Helen slowly lowered her champagne glass beside me. Across the room, several guests deliberately avoided looking in my direction altogether. Shame has a strange way of spreading socially, even when it belongs to someone else. I looked at Vanessa standing confidently beside my son beneath thousands of dollars of imported flowers and custom lighting I had unknowingly financed, and something inside me became perfectly still. Not angry, not wounded, finished. Because there is a moment in every humiliation when pain quietly transforms into clarity. I placed my napkin carefully beside my untouched dessert plate and stood up slowly from my chair. The movement alone drew attention. Vanessa's smile faltered almost immediately. Daniel looked toward me fully for the first time all evening. Around us, conversations faded beneath the soft hum of ballroom speakers and distant clinking glassware. I smoothed one hand lightly over Richard's diamond bracelet resting against my wrist before speaking calmly into the silence. "Actually, Vanessa," I said gently, "since we are discussing business transactions tonight, perhaps this is the perfect time to clarify a few things." The ballroom fell into the kind of silence money cannot buy away. Vanessa remained frozen beneath the chandelier lights, holding the microphone too tightly, while Daniel stared at me like he no longer recognized the woman standing near the back of the room. Around us, 300 guests suddenly became very interested in their champagne glasses and dessert plates. Nobody wants to witness family humiliation until it becomes impossible to look away from. I kept my voice calm. That seemed to unsettle Vanessa more than anger would have. "You are absolutely right about one thing," I said softly. "Generosity should never feel transactional." Vanessa forced a brittle smile. "Margaret, I was only joking." "Of course," I replied gently. "And since we are joking publicly tonight, I think transparency is appropriate." Daniel shifted uncomfortably beside her. "Mom," he said quietly into the microphone-free silence, "maybe this is not the time." I looked at my son carefully. He suddenly looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with weddings. Actually, Daniel, I said, this is precisely the time. Vanessa lowered the microphone slightly. Her polished confidence had started cracking around the edges now. Tiny things revealed it. The tension in her jaw. The quick movement of her eyes toward the wedding planner near the ballroom doors. The way her smile no longer reached her face. I continued speaking evenly. About 40 minutes ago, my accounting office informed me that nearly $78,000 in unauthorized wedding expenses were processed through my household accounts over the past several weeks. A ripple moved quietly through the ballroom. Not loud, just enough. Vanessa laughed too quickly. That cannot be right. I tilted my head slightly. The imported floral upgrades were correct though, yes? And the after-party catering? The champagne tower? The luxury transportation package? Her expression changed almost invisibly at each item. I watched the realization spread slowly across Daniel's face beside her. Vanessa, he said quietly. What is she talking about? She turned toward him instantly. Your mother is overreacting because she feels embarrassed. That word again. Embarrassed. As though dignity itself had become inconvenient for younger people whenever accountability entered the room. I reached into my clutch purse calmly and removed my phone. The pending wire transfers scheduled after midnight have already been canceled. Complete silence now. Even the band had stopped playing entirely. Somewhere near the bar, a glass clinked softly against marble. Vanessa stared at me. You canceled them? Immediately. Daniel stepped forward then, confusion replacing exhaustion across his face. Mom, what pending transfers? I looked directly at him for the first time all evening. The ones submitted under your secondary authorization credentials. His face went pale beneath the ballroom lighting. I did not authorize anything. Vanessa spoke sharply before I could answer. Daniel, do not do this here. But something had shifted inside him now. The careful social performance was collapsing too quickly to maintain. Did you use my account access? He asked her quietly. Vanessa's composure finally cracked. Oh my God, listen to yourself. After everything I did to make this wedding happen. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances nearby. Helen remained perfectly still beside my empty table, watching everything with the calm expression of someone who had already seen the ending coming. Vanessa turned back toward me, lowering her voice but failing to lower her anger. You know what your problem is, Margaret? You think money gives you ownership over people. I almost smiled at that. Not because it was cruel, because it was revealing. No, Vanessa, I said softly. I think honesty determines whether people deserve access to kindness. The ballroom remained silent around us, while Daniel stared at his new wife with growing disbelief. In that moment, he looked less like a groom and more like a man waking up inside a life he had not fully examined before signing himself into it. And suddenly, for the first time all evening, Vanessa looked afraid. Vanessa stood perfectly still beneath the chandelier lights, but the illusion surrounding her had finally begun to collapse. You could feel it spreading quietly through the ballroom, like cold air slipping under a locked door. Guests no longer looked at her with admiration. They looked at her carefully now, cautiously. People become very uncomfortable once charm stops protecting someone from consequences. Daniel turned toward her slowly. His expression caught somewhere between disbelief and humiliation. Did you really use my credentials? He asked again, quieter this time. Vanessa let out a short laugh that sounded far too sharp for a wedding reception. Oh please, Daniel. Do not stand there pretending you had no idea how expensive this wedding became. That is not what I asked. His voice remained calm, but I recognized something in it immediately. Richard used to sound exactly like that during board meetings right before someone lost his trust permanently. Vanessa looked around the ballroom as if searching for support from the crowd itself, but nobody moved to rescue her. Even her bridesmaids suddenly seemed fascinated by their cocktails. Everything I did was for us, she snapped finally. For our future. For appearances. I almost smiled at that word again. Appearances. It had governed this entire evening from the beginning. The flowers. The ballroom. The photographs. The rehearsed affection. Even the cruelty had been carefully dressed in polished social language. I looked at Daniel quietly. Your father spent 42 years teaching me that character matters most when nobody believes they are being watched. Daniel lowered his eyes briefly. For the first time all evening, he looked ashamed. Not of me, of himself. That difference mattered more than he probably realized. Vanessa suddenly stepped down from the stage, the long white train of her gown sweeping sharply across polished marble as she approached me. Up close, I could see panic beginning to crack through the makeup and elegance. "You are enjoying this, aren't you?" she whispered tightly, making me look small in front of everyone. I met her gaze calmly. "No, Vanessa, you accomplished that part yourself." Her face hardened instantly. For a moment, she looked ready to say something crueler, something designed to wound publicly one final time. But then Alan Brooks entered the ballroom through the side doors carrying a slim black folder beneath one arm. He approached carefully, his professional expression composed but serious. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said politely before glancing toward Daniel. "I apologize for interrupting the reception, but the trust authorization documents required immediate clarification." Vanessa's face lost what little color remained. Daniel frowned. "What trust documents?" Alan opened the folder carefully. Following Richard Whitmore's passing, several family assets were placed under protected review structures, including the downtown condominium currently occupied by you and Mrs. Whitmore. Daniel blinked. "What does that mean?" Alan hesitated slightly before answering. "Ownership remains under Margaret Whitmore's living trust until specific financial conditions are met." Silence settled heavily around us again. I watched the realization move slowly across Daniel's face. The condo, the luxury apartment Vanessa proudly called theirs. The place where they hosted dinner parties and posted holiday photographs online. It had never legally belonged to them at all. Vanessa stared at me in disbelief. "You never told us that. You never asked," I replied softly. Her voice rose slightly now, desperation replacing elegance. "So what? You are threatening us with housing now." I shook my head gently. "No, I am simply correcting a misunderstanding. There is a difference." Alan quietly handed me the folder before stepping back again. Around us, guests pretended not to listen while hearing every word. Daniel looked suddenly exhausted beyond his years. He rubbed one hand slowly across his forehead before turning toward Vanessa. "How much debt are we actually in?" That question changed everything. Because for the first time that evening, he was no longer asking his wife for reassurance. He was asking for the truth. Vanessa opened her mouth, but said nothing. And in the silence that followed, the marriage suddenly looked very different than it had an hour earlier beneath the chandeliers and imported roses.